What's up folks, CrushSG back with my post 1.3 review update on Zhongli. The reason I'm calling this a review update rather than a re-review is because I think Zhongli has been around long enough for folks to have a pretty good idea of what he's about. So what I'm going to do instead is only go over what I personally think the 1.3 buffs change with regard to my original review and give any additional thoughts I have on Zhongli right now. For those who didn't watch my original review, here's a quick recap. I felt that Zhongli was an excellent support unit who brought the strongest shield in the game, hard CC, and good burst DPS. His primary flaws were his mediocre and sometimes inconsistent energy regen, low pillar resonance damage, as well as his mediocre carry potential, strictly in my opinion of course. I ultimately concluded that despite me liking him and using him as a support unit personally, he just didn't bring enough to the table as a 5-star unit for me to give him a pull recommendation. Alright, let's quickly go over the basics of the buffs. No math for this folks, I've already mathed the buffs to death in previous videos. This is just going to be some basic information, my thoughts and conclusions. The change to dominance of Earth gives his entire kit varying degrees of HP scaling. This buff on its own ends up almost doubling the damage dealt by Zhongli's normal attack, charge attacks, as well as his pillar and pillar resonance damage. The addition of a 20% universal resistance shred to his Jade Shield takes this a step further and increases all damage dealt by himself and his team. We also have to change to his E-skill hold function, which as suspected only works for pillar creation and not for pillar repositioning. More on this in a bit. The change also adds interruption resistance while casting his shield, but I personally never had much of an issue with being interrupted to begin with, so this doesn't really affect my conclusions either way. Next we have the change to Geo Shields, which effectively increases his already very beefy shield by 50%. And finally, the change to Geo Resonance increases shield strength by 15% and adds a 20% Geo Resistance shred, increasing Zhongli's shield strength and damage even more. Alright, now that we know what the buffs do, let's go over how they change things for Zhongli as a unit. Getting the E-skill change out of the way first, the change to his E-hold definitely improves the utility of the skill because it allows you to start the fight with both a pillar and a shield and maintain that pillar and shield up indefinitely just using E-holds. However, because it only creates a pillar if there is less than the maximum number of pillars on the field, mid-combat pillar repositioning will still often require you to use the tap function, and this somewhat limits the utility gained from the change. A simple workaround would be to make it a habit to wait for the original pillar to disappear before recasting your shield so that it will place the new pillar at your current location. Of course, it's important to note that if you have Zhongli at C2, things are much simpler because chances are that you'll already have a shield up from using his burst whenever it comes up. Next, the buff to Geo Shields benefits all of Zhongli's builds significantly by increasing shield strength. But particularly interesting is that it makes running a full attack support Zhongli a properly viable option because you still retain a very respectable shield. As I showed in my buff roundup video, a full attack Zhongli post 1.3 can have an effective shield strength that rivals a pre 1.3 full HP Zhongli. Conversely, the buff to his damage would also make running a full HP Zhongli more viable because not only does it bring a ridiculous shield, it now brings respectable support damage too. On the damage front, with the various increases to his damage sources, it's safe to say that Zhongli effectively deals more than twice the damage he did pre-1.3 from all sources except his burst, which only gains additional damage from both the resistance shreds because it didn't receive any changes to HP scaling from the buffs. The boost to his normal and charge attack damage increases Zhongli's efficacy as a carry because you'd naturally be using these attacks a lot in that role. Additionally, the boost to pillar resonance damage contributes to an increase in Zhongli's overall sustained DPS, even more so at C1 because you essentially have twice the damage from having 2 pillars down. Now, whether all these damage buffs ultimately bring Zhongli's carry potential to a competitive level, I can't really say because I don't run him as a carry myself, but I should think that it'll have a significant impact on his carry capabilities. Maybe some of the Zhongli mains out there can chime in the comments. Do you think the buff was enough for him as a carry? Anyway, things change even more drastically for Zhongli on the support front. As mentioned earlier, prior to 1.3, Zhongli brought hard CC, a beefy shield, and good burst DPS. Overall good, but not terribly unique or spectacular from a support value perspective. The post 1.3 Zhongli now brings a hard CC, a virtually indestructible shield, very good burst DPS, very respectable off-field sustained DPS, and a 20% universal resistance shred to top it off. Now if you think that's a long list of pros even for a 5-star unit, you'd be right. You know how Venti or Bennett tend to be present in almost every comp to date? Well, for better or worse, these buffs might have given Zhongli a violent shove into that category as well. Digging a little deeper, the Universal Resistance Shred is a huge buff to Zhongli's utility. The way Resistance Shred works is that any shred below 0% is halved. This means shredding resistances above 0% bring the most value. The average enemy has a base resistance of 10%, and thus a 20% shred gets the average enemy down to -5%. This effectively takes care of the most significant boost zone for resistance shredding, diminishing the value of additional shreds like Superconductor somewhat. What this means is the buff now puts Zhongli in a unique position where he can be used to either outright replace an existing single element shred unit, giving up 20% of that specific element shred in exchange for a universal 20% shred, or he can be swapped with another teammate to further augment the existing 40% shred with an additional 20% shred. All this while bringing a huge shield, good burst damage, decent pillar resonance damage, and a hard CC. On the Geo Team front, it's now honestly really hard to make an argument to not run Zhongli as the second Geo unit on the team, unless you don't have him of course. 40% total Geo Shred plus all the benefits I mentioned earlier. Going a step further, if you happen to have Albedo as well and run a Geo carry, it's tough to even make an argument to not run 3 Geo units on that team with the last slot left for specific shield breaks. It doesn't matter which Geo unit you run as a carry, having both Albedo and Zhongli on that team is pretty much a no-brainer now. And this is where I have to pause all the buff hype and talk about some of my concerns. The fact that Zhongli has become such a powerful support unit effectively sidelines all other Geo units as supports, and for that matter sidelines many non-Geo supports as well. Yes, even Albedo, who is already a phenomenal Geo support unit, now feels much less phenomenal next to Zhongli. I don't know how I feel about that honestly, it's kinda tough to describe. I know some are throwing the word power creep around, but I don't quite buy it just yet. Yet being the operative word. I've played an ungodly amount of games with ridiculous power creep, and I just don't think whatever is happening right now qualifies as power creep the way I understand it. Rather, I think this is just a plain and simple overbalance on miHoYo's part. You know, a knee-jerk reaction to the intense backlash following Zhongli's launch. Now I said overbalance, not overbuff. I think the magnitude of the buff itself is fine. I just think that it was skewed too heavily toward his support value. It feels like miHoYo patched together a bunch of buffs that looked good individually on paper, threw it on the very next beta test, and rushed it to the live game without taking the time to consider how the buffs would truly affect game balance when applied together on a single unit. Anyway, enough of the negative stuff. I won't bite the hand that feeds me too much, so let's wrap things up. In my opinion, these buffs are huge for Zhongli. Now I hate to use the phrase, but this really does change everything for him. In my initial review, I concluded that he didn't bring enough to the table as a 5-star unit to warrant a pull recommendation from me, and well, I'm gonna have to somewhat amend that. I think that Zhongli is definitely worth pulling for if he ever gets a rerun. C0 is more than enough for him to bring almost all his value, and that's where my pull recommendation ends. That said, for those with primos to spare, C1 gives him double pillars, which actually matters a little more now because his pillar resonance damage is a lot higher. C2 gives him a free shield when you use his burst, making the support rotation pretty brainless. And C4 buffs his burst AoE and petrified duration. Now I'd be careful about his C6 though. It looks like we're getting new units and weapons that benefit from having specifically low HP, and his C6 could end up being a liability for those units. Kinda like how C6 Bennett is kind of a liability for certain teams. Again, I'm not recommending that you pull for constellations, just telling you what the constellations bring to the table. I personally have him at C4 and will probably go for C5 if he ever gets a rerun down the road for the extra burst levels. Alright folks, that's all for my Zhongli review update. As always, thumbs if you liked it, drop me a comment and crush that subscribe button. I'll catch you in the next one.